The first stone slid as if deciding for them, a tired breath from the earth that carried the smell of frankincense and rain that never fell. And Layla felt the desert lean closer, listening. Warnings incised in a priest's careful hand glimmered like wet ink in the lamplight. Do not stir the breath of Amun. Do not wake the morning heart. But the plumb line of history has no mercy once it starts to drop. Omar read the signs aloud, his voice threading the dust with vowels older than the wind. Sophia steadied her hands around a seam that had not been touched since a king's shadow was a public fact. Beneath the lintel, a lacquered coffin waited, its paint dark as a moonless Nile. When they loosened the final copper tie, the lid rose on the whisper of pooled resin, and in the hush that followed a sound began, a dry clicking like rain against papyrus, like time crossing a threshold on many legs. Something inside was moving, not with the shiver of gas or trick of light, but with purpose. A rough little tide pushing against the centuries, insisting on its right to go on. By morning, the tomb mouth had learned their names. Wind called them one by one and carried the syllables down the steps like offerings. Lila worked with the formal calm she put on like a second shirt, issuing quiet orders, packing fear into lists. Omar revised his translations beneath the awning where sun made papyrus glare. He muttered that the lector priest had guarded something that beats. Sophia catalogued with ritual care, sliding trays as if coaxing a child to sleep, every brushstroke a lullaby against despair. Victor prowled like a wolf denied, the sponsor's smile thinning whenever the cameras failed to find him. Buddha set boundaries with the steadiness of law. She had the look of one who measures damage before it happens. Mahmud fetched water, laughed softly to smooth the air. Only Father Youssef seemed to listen to the tomb instead of at it, holding his candle in the shade so its flame could speak. There are movements that are not life, he said, and lives that move on after movement ends. The second door surrendered with less drama, a plastered seal that had been broken and resealed, history's equivalent of crossed fingers. Inside waited painted stars peeling like old confetti, and a niche whose alabaster jar sang when tapped. Omar traced the name, Nesaman, while Layla measured the chamber with a surveyor's patience, seeing axe lines, tool chatter, intentional grooves. The choreography of devotion made stone. The clicking had ceased, but something else replaced it. A soft, almost musical quiver, as if a coin hummed on the lip of a bowl. Father Youssef recognized the melody. Not notes, but intervals of air. A measure set by the earth. Sophia angled a light and found a pendulum cradled in a bronze yoke, a tier of dark metal poised over a shallow dish. Mercury, she breathed. A ritual heart that stirs with tremor, with footfall, with approaching hands. The priest had designed an instrument that would go on moving so long as the ground itself did. An imitation of life to frighten thieves, or to remind the living why hearts are guarded. At lunch, the wind rose, and with it a quarrel. Victor called the press from the satellite phone, promising motion in a mummy like a fairground barker polishing sin into marvel. Buddha's voice turned to ice, her pen a spear. The law says nothing leaves, nothing errs without review. Layla listened, counted to 8 on her fingers inside her pocket, then asked Omar to read the ostraka again. The words were plain and sly. The heart beats where the god walks. To touch it is to be counted among the deaf. Sophia considered the colony in the coffin, those black constellations that woke to warmth. Seasonal intruders, yes, but also participants in a rite that bends the living to tend the dead. Father Youssef said the trick of holiness is that it uses what it finds, the wind, the bugs, the tremor of a heel, and makes a calendar of it. Mahmud, who had no patience for sacred speech, simply said, "More wedges, fewer promises." The desert smirked like a cat with secrets. Night drew a lid over the site and left the stars to listen for them. Layla returned alone to the threshold, carrying neither boldness nor fear, only the sense that her breath should not disturb the breath already here. She sat on the cool step, and let the pendulum murmur through the stone into her bones. A lullaby from metal to marrow. In the coffin, under gauze re-stiffened by centuries of resin, the scarabs rearranged themselves into an orbit around the heart amulet, as if fidelity were a pattern one could learn by proximity. She thought of her grandmother's pulse when fever had ransomed it, how the wrist under her fingers taught her to wait. The desert wind found the arch of the doorway and made a flute of it. Far off a jackal answered, with a line ascending. Behind her came Father Youssef, candle lighted in his palm, and together they sat like two words in a sentence nobody had yet spoken aloud. When it came, it would not be about death. It would be about the education of movement. Dawn sloped into the wadi like a poured blade, and with it came the lists, the labels, the sober grammar of custody that Layla trusted when belief grew loud. Sophia built a perimeter of soft brushes and promises, coaxing the coffin's colony to stillness with temperature and shade. Omar, hawk-eyed, sketched the pendulum cradle and murmured that its yoke was tuned to tremor, that footsteps became doctrine here. Victor arrived with a film crew he'd magicked from the dust, a smile lacquered on, the kind of grin that turns a discovery into a product. Huda stood between lens and lintel, quoting articles and penalties, until the camera's red light went out like a shamed lantern. Father Youssef traced the wall stars with a thumb and said the old makers understood nerves, how a room can feel walked in even when empty. Mahmoud, reading faces, split the crew, half to shore the trench, half to fetch timber. Beneath all this a clicking stirred, a patient metronome, as if the tomb were testing their resolve note by note. They worked a choreography of distance, Layla counting beats between movements, Sophia misting the air to lull the living alphabet inside the coffin, Omar reading aloud in a tone that made warnings sound like lullabies. The pendulum answered them with a shy quiver, each time the ground admitted their weight. Victor paced the perimeter like a denied appetite, selling futures with his eyes to the men who held the boom and the hope of a scoop. Huda took his contracts and found their spines, snapping pages back until clauses apologized. Mahmoud braced the chamber with timber kisses, small supports that multiplied into safety. Father Youssef collected silence in cupped hands, then poured it gently where panic gathered. And under gauze, the scarabs reorganized as if choreographed by a priest's afterthought, clustering around the heart amulet in patterns that made Omar mutter about calendars of devotion. The room became a body with many breaths. To move was to be counted, to speak was to add weight, and every added weight taught the mechanism to live. The coffined heart had a grammar of its own. When Sophia lifted a corner of stiffened gauze, the colony flowed to shade with liquid unanimity, a tide obeying two moons, light and warmth. Omar pointed to a painted formula. The morning heart learns from footsteps. The evening heart listens to the stars. Lila measured airflow at the doorway and found a whispering draft that stroked the pendulum like a harpist testing strings. Father Youssef smiled at the thought of artisans listening to wind until it taught them liturgy. Victor proposed a live stream. Huda answered with fines that grew a zero each time he spoke. Mahmoud unearthed a sealed alcove beside the niche, its plaster clean as a kept promise, and Layla's pulse stuttered at the sound a tool makes when it touches something that was meant to stay quiet. The room's temperature stepped down like a choir descending, with a nod that was more prayer than order. Layla called for lamps, trays, patience, and the smallest brush they owned. Plaster flaked like old snow, and the alcove's mouth opened to a dark kept sweet. Inside, a wax-sealed jar lay in a nest of linen that time had ambered, and when Sophia teased the lid, a perfume climbed out. Honey amplified by myrrh, sun thickened into scent. Omar murmured of offerings meant to feed a heart that must be convinced to continue. Layla steadied the jar with a conservator's humility rather than a director's right. She felt how the room brightened around kindness. The scarab stirred with the fragrance, forming a ring as if a long rehearsal had reached its cue. Victor made the pitch again. This smell, this moment. This is television. But Hooted's no was a fortress with clean lines. Mahmoud, who knew the language of collapse, heard a grit shift above the false ceiling and touched the beam like a friend. Father Youssef crossed himself without evangelizing. He only honored the labor. The pendulum acknowledged them with a single bright twitch, as though the tomb agreed. Proceed, but as if watched. Word outran permission. By afternoon, a ribbon of SUVs scrawled the horizon and anchors rehearsed their solemn faces, promising reverence while practicing intrusion. Lila centered the team with a protocol spoken like a spell. No lenses past the second step, all movement logged. No one alone with the dead. Huda posted tapes and officers who understood that history is a boundary, not a buffet. Victor peeled away to charm investors by the coffee urn and returned with a demand for an unveiling by sunset. Sophia whispered that sunlight would wake the colony into frenzy, and Omar added that the text warned of deafness for those who rushed the heart. Mahmoud handed out earplugs anyway. The practical kindness of a man who knows noise finds you. Father Youssef asked for a moment of shared quiet, not prayer, only breath, and the team complied. In that pooled stillness, the pendulum sang a thin, quick note, as if striking flint, and every face learned the same lesson at once. Motion can be a command, or it can be a plea. By the third morning, the texts began to agree with each other like witnesses who had rehearsed, and that unanimity made Layla uneasy. Omar laid Ostraka side by side until their margins kissed. The same phrase threaded them all. The morning heart must be kept speaking. The pendulum's bright tear answered each footfall with the tact of a diplomat. The scarabs, lulled by shade and careful mist, gathered around the green stone like a choir facing a conductor. Victor announced a timetable in the tone of a man who thinks time salutes him. Huda arrayed statutes that did not. Sophia argued for patience with the gentleness of one who nurses the wounded. Mahmoud translated her caution into timbers and braces and slower tools. Father Youssef said the old craftsman had built a theater where nerves become ritual, and ritual teaches mercy to curiosity. Lila felt the desert pressing for an answer. Will you take what moves, or will you let it keep moving where it belongs? The question threaded every breath. Omar's translation grew teeth. He found a hymn that did not praise so much as instruct. Where the god's foot stirs the floor, the heart will answer. When the deaf approach, it falls still. He traced the determinatives with a lover's accuracy and said, this was not a warning to thieves alone, but a contract with the living. A demand that devotion be measured in quiet steps and clean intentions. Sophia, eyes salt bright, insisted the net and amulet must remain where the mechanism completes them, or the language of the tomb will be broken mid-sentence. Victor called it superstition, then sold it to himself as branding. Authenticity as spectacle. Huda's silence made the room smaller around him. Mahmoud muttered that houses collapse when their best stones are moved, and Layla heard in that a blueprint for restraint. Father Youssef added that relics misbehave when orphaned. The pendulum struck a shallow circle and stilled, as if to show them what deafness looked like. No one exhaled until it spoke again. The argument finally chose a table and sat down. Victor wanted the Heart Scarab assembly out by evening, a hero's lift staged for sponsors and screens. Sophia spoke of humidity gradients and fragile risens. Omar spoke of grammar and oaths. Mahmoud spoke of loads and the lazy malevolence of old ceilings. Huda stacked permits like shields and said nothing leaves until a committee signs in ink that dries slower than sand. Father Youssef, in the voice he saved for funerals and weddings, said the dead are not props. Lila listened to each, mapping their words onto the chamber like lines of force, and saw where the stress would run if she surrendered to haste. She felt the tomb as an instrument tuned to shame the reckless. Then the scarabs lifted as one, a rustling punctuation, and formed a ring that resembled the determinative for heart. The pendulum flicked toward them and steadied. Lila closed her notebook on the decision blooming there. Nothing integral would move. Not today. Not for cameras. Not for coin. Lila put resolve into procedure. They built a microclimate around the coffin. Shade panels, dampened linens, a perimeter marked by blue chalk that even dust hesitated to cross. She logged every breath of air that touched the amulet, every tremor the pendulum admitted, as if turning obedience into data could pacify those who do not understand reverence. Omar returned to the hymn and found a marginal note. No thief, but a caretaker's joke. That, said the heart, answers laughter best. Mahmoud laughed obligingly, and the pendulum twitched, a small miracle that loosened shoulders. Sophia prepared a reversible shroud, silk and patience stitched together, with the promise that it could all be undone without harm. Huda briefed the officers on crowd control with the precision of a siege plan. Victor phoned a lawyer. Father Youssef set his candle by the threshold and called it a lighthouse. For a breath span, the tomb felt less like a trap and more like a room that could keep its promises if they kept theirs. Late light slanted into the wadi like a verdict and found them still at their stations. The press line grumbled beyond Huda's cordon. Victor rehearsed a monologue to an invisible camera, each take smoother and less true. Inside, the pendulum answered, only footsteps that entered with patience. Lila, finally alone with the coffin, lifted the silk and studied the net's fine fractures, the way gold tired at its soldered joints, the way the amulet's green swallowed light and returned it warmer. She murmured to the priest whose name inked the room, Nesimon, we will not unteach your heart. And for once the scarabs did not stir, as if agreeing to keep the secret breathing in place. Omar stepped in to report that the hymn's last line asked the living to leave a stela when they depart, a promise carved in stone that the heart may go on beating without them. Layla nodded and felt the story choose its spine. Not extraction. Covenant. The desert wind tapped the doorway like a knuckle, asking blessing. Morning arrived with a chalky sky and a silence that pressed on the ear like water. Mahmud's crew pried at a flagged stone in the antechamber, and the sound it made, hollow, resentful, turned everyone's heads. Lila knelt and brushed away flour-fine grit to reveal a course of brickwork not Theban at all, but a later hand's impatience. Lime mortar ridden hard with pebbles, the bite marks of a different empire. Omar's mouth shaped a word he didn't want. Roman, while Huda's pen found a new page titled Intrusion. Sophia spoke softly about the way afterlives accumulate tenants, how the faithful get roommates they never invited. Victor, scenting a shortcut to spectacle, suggested the later passage might grant a cleaner lift for the coffin, his optimism a pickaxe aimed at conscience. Father Youssef glanced at the painted stars and said, Time is a crowded chapel. You don't barge between prayers, the pendulum answered with a single bright nod, as if to mark this too in the ledger of trespass and custody. The room tightened, deciding. They opened the foreign throat with a surgeon's reluctance. The bricks came away in sulking slabs, revealing a crawlspace cramped by centuries of breathless decisions. Inside lay a scatter of amphora sherds stamped with Latin letters, a bronze coin dim as an old bruise, and a broken intaglio whose god wore a wreath, alien to this hillside. Omar said the Romans had come like latecomers to a feast, chewing without tasting. Layla tasted anger anyway, a metallic tang under the tongue, and forced it down into protocol. Sophia lifted a cloth-wrapped packet and found inside another jar, its wax still proud over the lip. The scent escaping like a story, impatient to be told. Honey again, but darker, as if years had taught it the grammar of graves. Victor spoke of signatures and ownership, as though the tomb were a document waiting his pen. Huda reminded him the only signatures allowed were wind and time. The pendulum tremored in a narrow arc, a pulse that seemed to say, not the first, you, and perhaps not the last. So behave. Midday gathered itself into a single hot thought. And that was when the mechanism woke, as if summoned by a chorus of mistakes. A camera dolly nudged the threshold despite Huda's line. Mahmoud's boot corrected, timber kissed stone, air shifted, and the pendulum's mercury tear began to shiver with an intimacy that stole breath. It drew a widening loop, skimming the lip of its dish with a sound like glass learning to speak. Scarabs within the coffin rose in a swirling sentence, punctuation in motion, commas becoming exclamation. Panic lifted its head. Sophia's hand froze. Lila's orders stacked hard and simple. Stillness. Shade. Seal the door. Omar. Voice low as water, read the hymn's cadence into the room, aligning breath with beat. Father Youssef set his palm near the coil of movement without touching, offering a human metronome. The swarm obeyed rhythm more than fear, settling by degrees as the pendulum's circle narrowed to a thoughtful nod. Victor, who wanted spectacle, finally looked afraid, because the room had taught him it could make a life if pressed. When the room released them, it did so with the sternness of a survived lesson. Layla reset the perimeter, voice softened by the tremor still living in her bones. Omar traced a new annotation on the wall plan. Amplitude equals trespass, a note to future selves. Sophia examined the heart amulet's setting and found hairline stress along the net, a fatigue that begged for still days and the patience of silk. Mahmoud recalculated his ceiling supports until even his caution felt extravagant. Huda escorted the Dali team out with the ceremonial grace reserved for banishments. Victor, cornered by the proof that the tomb could perform too well, pivoted into a new demand. If the lift could not happen, then at least the lid should be raised for a single conclusive shot. Father Youssef said every miracle needs a gatekeeper. Layla, hearing in the air a rumor of shifting stone higher up the slope, felt the desert's longer plot sharpening. The Roman throat had weakened more than pride. She chose quiet as a weapon and ordered dusk. Dusk colored the wadi in iron and peach, and with it came the choice Victor had been grooming all day. He brought signatures, a practiced apology, and a camera twisted to look modest. A small lift, he said, like a thief promising to borrow. Huda's no was a wall, Omar's scholarship a moat, Sophia's conservation plan a drawbridge that would never drop before night. Mahmoud folded his arms into an argument older than paperwork. Father Youssef's silence occupied the last available chair. Lila felt the slope groan in her feet. Somewhere above, the Roman bricks remembered their unkindness, and she realized denial would not be enough. She told Victor there would be no lift, not small or large, not tonight or ever. And when he stepped toward the coffin, the colony stirred like a verdict. The pendulum marked a single, silver syllable and held. Wind shouldered the awning. Sand hissed down the steps like a rehearsal for collapse. "We seal it dark," Layla said. "We return with a stela," the desert answered with a breath. "You could almost count." Night came down like a lid tightened by a careful hand, and with it, the ordinary fatigue that makes bad choices seem efficient. The press lights retreated to the road. The wind rehearsed its throat on the awning struts. Lila ran the day backward in her notes until the rhythms felt right again, but the pendulum held a new impatience. A bright quiver that heard something she did not. Omar worked a fresh line from an ostrakon. When the heart is hurried, it hides. And he said it almost lightly, as if the tune could be bargained with. Sophia checked the silk for snag points and wrote humidity figures that looked like prayers trying not to be. Huda returned from a call with the ministry shaped like a shield that would not arrive until morning. Mahmoud tapped a beam and frowned at the dust. It shrugged. Father Youssef warmed his candle near the threshold, making a small sun that steadied the room, and just beyond the cordon, Victor's silhouette angled inward, appetite finding an hour. They prepared the reversible shroud as if dressing a truth for weather. Sophia's hands moved in the pedagogy of care, smoothing silk over gauze, while Layla read ambient numbers like an omen she could soothe with math. Omar found a marginal note that made him chuckle. Laughter lightens the heart. And when Mahmoud obliged with a dry joke, the pendulum answered with a modest nod that unknotted everyone's shoulders for a breath. Huda drafted the morning's resealing plan, a choreography of signatures, gaskets, and ink. She said the word covenant and let it stand. Father Youssef spoke of thresholds and how you crossed them twice, once with feet and once with intention. The scarabs, drowsy under managed cool, gathered into a patient ring, a low tide of devotion. Somewhere outside, a door of wind thudded shut against the hillside. Victor disappeared, and the relief of it was so immediate that no one tracked the absence as danger, only as weather improving. The breach announced itself not with a shout, but with a practiced quiet. A zipper unzipped from the wrong side, a lens hood turned inward, a breath held for profit. Victor slid past the cordon with a cameraman he had not earned, and together they angled toward the coffin as if approaching a tame animal. Mahmoud saw first, a low curse turning into bootfalls. Huda's voice followed with the flat authority that stops most men. But tonight, it met a contract signed elsewhere. Victor's fingers found the lid's edge. The pendulum brightened, a mercury star learning to spin. Sophia hissed daunt and moved faster than fear. Layla crossed the chalk line she'd drawn and set her palm on the lid with a force that said no more than law. Omar's voice braided the hymn into the air, the cadence pulling breath into order. The scarabs rose in a soft storm, a black aurora over green stone, and the room filled with the delicate thunder of many small lives insisting on their orbit. The ceiling spoke next, a dry cough of stone that turned every head. The Roman throat I'd unbricked remembered its neglect. Dust streamed like pale rain, and a hairline jag across the plaster ran on into a sentence nobody wanted to finish. Lila made the choice like a reflex honed by 100 smaller mercies. Lives before objects, integrity before trophies, language before noise. She told Mahmoud to brace the crawl space, Sophia to cocoon the net in silk without lifting, Huda to clear the chamber to half strength and hold the doorway like a dam. Omar read the hymn's closing as if it were first aid, guiding breath to match the pendulum's diminishing arc. Father Youssef gathered the loose relic trays like a deacon saving communion from a sudden wind. Victor protested with a contract shout until his own fear made him quiet. The scarabs settled in a ring as if obeying choreography, older than masonry, and the mercury tear steadied to a single silver syllable. Stay. Wind shouldered the wadi until the awning thrummed, and inside the tomb, a hush expanded that was not peace, but discipline. The fracture held for now, a promise the hill could revoke at whim. Lila called the count. 10 to withdraw. 3 to remain, assigning bodies to tasks that felt like vows. Mahmoud to the braces, Sophia to the shroud, Omar to the text, Huda to the line, Father Youssef to the fire of the candle that would be last to leave. Victor stood at the edge of his ambition and finally recognized it as peril. He said nothing. And that was his first useful act. The scarabs completed their circuit around the green heart, as if resetting a clock, and the pendulum answered with a small bow that looked like consent. Lila imagined the stela they would raise at dawn and felt the story spend its anger on purpose. Above them, the hill grumbled a warning. Below, the room learned to be still again. They sealed the lids they could and left the one that mattered breathing. The hill chose its hour with the cruelty of clocks that never cared for people. Just before dawn, when bodies are most honest about their limits, a groan moved through the slope like a thought changing its mind. Lila felt it in her teeth. The pendulum felt it in its skin. Dust knit along the Roman throat and sifted into the chamber in a hush too deliberate to ignore. Omar whispered that the hymn's last verb could mean keep or leave, depending on where the breath paused, and the ambiguity struck Leela as the most truthful thing the tomb had said. Sophia checked her figures and found the humidity rising like panic in a chest. Mahmud's hand on the brace read a story of strain, traveling faster than help. Huda spoke with the ministry again, promising a resal at first light, permits be sanctified later. Father Youssef steadied the candle's small sun and said, "Not prayer, but presence." Victor stood with contrition pulled tight over habit, and even that felt like a brace holding for now. The first crack did not ask permission. It ripped a thin seam from the Roman bricks across the plaster, like lightning trapped in stone, and the pendulum answered with a bright, terrified circle that kissed its dish and sang. Lila's voice found the register that turns people into a single organism. Victor with me, Mahmud, sure. Sophia silk only, Omar, the cadence, Huda, the door. No one else in. The scarabs woke in a dark halo and streamed toward the heart, as if the amulet itself had exhaled a command. Omar's recital slowed the room's pulse, one beat at a time, the hymn passing from mouth to air to metal. Huda barred the entrance against the press and the well-meaning, a narrow gate between disaster and its audience. Father Youssef moved trays from Harm's itinerary. Victor surprised himself by obeying, hands steady on the lid, not to lift but to hold the world still. Stone dust salted their hair. The hill's breath shortened. Layla saw the choice arrive. The heart stays. We go. Collapse became a grammar of seconds. Mahmud read each tremor as a clause, and answered with timber punctuation, quick commas that kept the sentence from ending. Sophia stitched the silk shroud to anchor points on the coffin rails, without lifting so much as a sigh of gauze. Her hands spoke fluent gentleness. Omar's hymn reached its imperative, the verb that teaches breath to lengthen. The pendulum obeyed, arc narrowing toward a dignified nod. Huda made the corridor a filter that passed only necessity. Victor, sweating through his bravado, lent his weight where Layla pointed and discovered usefulness, can feel like absolution. Father Youssef slid the candle to the threshold and called it the edge of their obligation. Keep the fire, keep the living. Layla traced a final perimeter in blue chalk around the heart assembly, a ring that meant not ours. Then she set the plan like a benediction. A sand berm, a sacrificial brace, silk intact, no lift. The hill groaned. The room, incredibly, listened. The chamber asked for payment and they paid in restraint. Layla ordered the sacrificial brace. Mahmud set it like a knight taking a blow meant for a king. The beam cracked with a clean, brave sound, and the falling mass met it, momentum spent in splinters instead of bodies. A gust of dust erased sight to arm's length. In that blind interval, Sophia's hands held the silk in place as if faith were a fabric. Omar's voice never lost cadence. The hymn now a rope, they climbed by feel. Huda counted down the exit in 3s and 2s. Leaving Layla and Mahmud last because command and craft belong at the hinge. Father Youssef's candle guttered, flared, and steadied like a pulse finding itself. Victor, coughing, found words that were not a pitch but an apology. To the team, to the priest he had tried to sell. When the air cleared, the heart remained inside its blue ring, breathing by proxy through the colony and the pendulum's small bow. Layla touched the chalk once and left. Dawn climbed the wadi like a healer arriving late but sure. Outside, the air tasted rinsed. Inside, the chamber had learned stillness again. The press line stood hushed beyond Huda's cordon, chastened by the night's rumor. Layla called the count and found every name. That, more than any artifact, felt like victory. The heart scarab device remained in situ under silk within the blue ring. The colony drowsing like sentries after a long watch, the pendulum poised in its calm ascent. Omar closed his notes on a translation he would title Covenant. Sophia logged the condition report with a line she'd never written before. Integrity preserved by leaving. Mahmud wiped stone grit from his eyebrows and smiled the small, private smile of carpenters whose work holds. Father Youssef planted the candle in a shallow dish, like a votive for those who choose restraint. Victor asked what help looked like now and meant it. "A stela," Layla said. "Words that promise we understood." The hill, at last, was quiet. Morning widened its palm over the wadi until color returned to everything that had spent the night in grayscale, and the sight seemed to exhale a memory it had been holding too tightly. Layla assembled the team with the serenity of someone who has already chosen, and now must only honor what was chosen. Omar read the covenant he drafted, a text that bound the living to the room's continuing breath. The words did not argue, they promised. Sophia checked the silks lay one last time and smiled at how care can become architecture, how absence can be a stronger joint than any hammering will make. Mahmoud counted braces out like beads, each removed with a reverence normally reserved for setting them, and felt the hill answer with the contentment of a patient allowed to sleep. Huda arranged the formalities, seals, signatures, a procession of ink that turned intention into law. Father Youssef warmed the candle and said that light remembers what we decide. Victor stood with sleeves rolled and asked only, "Where do you need me?" They wrote the stela, where the wind could read it. Omar chose hieroglyphs that carried softness without surrender. Layla spaced the lines the way a mason spaces breaths. Sophia drafted a diagram of the device not to reproduce it, but to teach future hands how not to break its cheek. Sentence. Mahmoud measured limestone with the comfort of a man who trusts stone to say what he means better than he could, and Huda's pen turned their choices into an article that would withstand both parliament and gossip. Father Youssef offered a line in Coptic that translated to keep the heart where it belongs, and the phrasing settled on the page like dust deciding to be soil. Victor fetched water, shade, patience, useful nouns, then asked if his name should appear, and seemed relieved when Layla said no. Let the promise stand unnowned. In the tomb, the pendulum nodded when footsteps paused. The colony dozed in its orbit. Movement continued where it mattered, unfimed, unbothered, exact. At noon, they approached the threshold as if it were a shore they had learned not to cross except with the tide right. The cordon held the press at a respectful distance. Curiosity had acquired manners overnight. Layla read the covenant aloud, not for the cameras, but for the room. Omar spoke the priest's name the way you say an address before you open a door. Sophia checked the silk one last time and felt it hold like a hand you trust. Mahmoud's braces withdrew in a sequence that sounded almost musical, wood relinquishing weight without complaint. Huda presented the seal and its wax gleamed like a small, deliberate moon. Father Youssef lifted his candle and breathed on it. The flame bowed, rose, agreed. Victor steadied the stela as they carried it in, the least important hands doing an important thing, and the pendulum offered a discreet bow. No more and no less than acknowledgement. They did not unlearn movement. They placed it where it could continue without them. The resealing was slow, almost conversational. Stones returned to their partners with the tenderness of reconciled friends. Plaster smoothed its small weather across the seam. The doorway learned again how to hold a secret without malice. Layla placed the stela where dawn would kiss it first. Omar traced a final glyph at knee height for any child who might come one day and press a curious hand to the story. Sophia tucked a linen strip beneath a ledge so that future conservators would know a conservator had been here and had chosen to leave. Mahmoud set a final wedge with the finesse of a goodbye, said right. Huda pressed the seal while the wax still breathed and signed the registry over her own heart, as if to bind herself too. Father Youssef's candle smoked once, then cleared, the fragrance of myrrh threading the new mortar. Victor stepped back and let his shadow withdraw from the stone. Inside, the pendulum, unseen now, kept its modest appointment with tremor and time. Evening found them smaller in the landscape and larger in themselves. The press drifted away with the story they had not expected. Not a theft from silence, but a treaty with it. Lila stood where the stair met the desert and listened to the hill's slow contentment. The wind passed through the wadi in long vowels that sounded like breath at rest. Omar closed his notebook on a title that felt correct in the mouth. Covenant of the Morning Heart. Sophia washed her brushes and let the last ribbons of myrrh and honey rinse into the sand where they would become someone else's sweetness. Mahmoud rolled the remaining timbers and felt a craftsman's pride that nothing spectacular had broken. Huda filed her report under preservation by restraint and smiled at the shape of that victory. Father Youssef snuffed the candle with his palm and said amen to the air without asking it to reply. Victor shouldered a crate and did not look back. Below, behind stone and silk, something kept moving, as all faithful things do.